Sarasota, Florida. Super Bowl Sunday, February 1st, 2004. 11-year-old Carlie Brucia had spent the evening at a friend's house and was walking home around 6:15, eager to get back in time to watch the big game with her family. The kind of ordinary weekend plan that fills up so many households on that particular Sunday every year, when even people who don't normally follow football find themselves gathering around a television for the day. It was such an ordinary errand that her friend's mother actually called Carlie's own mother first, just to confirm it was really okay for an 11-year-old to walk that short distance home alone on a Sunday evening. Permission was given. It was the kind of small, reasonable parental check that happens in millions of households every single day. The sort of quiet, careful diligence that most parents exercise without ever imagining it might matter this much. And on any other evening, it would have meant absolutely nothing at all. Carlie's route home took her past Evie's car wash on Bee Ridge Road. An unremarkable stretch of road she'd likely walked or been driven past dozens of times before. She never made it any further than that parking lot. When Carlie didn't arrive home, her family's alarm turned into a search almost immediately. Investigators brought in a bloodhound, and the dog tracked her scent directly to that same car wash, along the exact route between the two houses. And it was there that detectives discovered something that would end up changing this entire case, and in some ways, the broader national conversation about crime and punishment within a matter of days. A security camera mounted outside the car wash had captured the entire abduction. The footage showed a man in a mechanic's uniform approaching Carlie, taking her by the arm and leading her out of frame. A yellow station wagon was visible nearby in the same shot. Before we go any further into what that footage set in motion, I want you to understand who Carlie actually was, because a case that becomes this widely broadcast, this endlessly replayed on national television, can sometimes reduce a real child to nothing more than the grainy figure in a piece of security footage. She was 11 years old, a 6th grader, the kind of kid who wanted nothing more complicated that particular Sunday than to get home in time for the Super Bowl with the people she loved. The sort of small, entirely ordinary family tradition that makes up so much of what childhood actually consists of. Her parents would later describe, with a kind of aching specificity, the exact expression on her face in those final seconds of video. Not fear, not familiarity, but simple, unsuspecting confusion. The look of a child who had no reason yet to understand that anything about that ordinary parking lot was dangerous at all. Her father would later tell a national television audience directly to look closely at his daughter's face in that footage, insisting that if she'd known the man or wanted to go with him, there would have been a smile there instead. A small, devastating piece of parental testimony offered specifically to counter any suggestion that Carlie had somehow willingly gone anywhere with a stranger. The car wash video was released publicly within days, and it spread with a speed and intensity that, in 2004, was still relatively new territory for a missing child case, arriving right at a moment when cable news cycles had become sophisticated enough to loop a single piece of footage for hours at a stretch. It aired on national news broadcasts, played on a loop, discussed and dissected by anchors and viewers across the entire country, becoming, within a matter of days, one of the most widely recognized pieces of video evidence in the entire history of American true crime. It's a strange, specific kind of horror, watching a stranger's hand close around a child's arm in real, unedited footage, no dramatization, no reenactment, just the thing itself, happening in real time, broadcast into homes far beyond Sarasota, into living rooms where parents watched with their own children nearby, unable to look away. And that horror turned out to be exactly what cracked this case open. Members of the Sarasota community, watching the same footage playing on their own televisions, began contacting law enforcement, certain they recognized the man in the mechanic's uniform, some of them apparently recognizing a coworker, a neighbor, or a familiar face from around town almost immediately. That recognition led investigators directly to a 39-year-old auto mechanic and father of 3 daughters named Joseph Smith. What investigators found, once they started looking closely at Smith's background, made this case, almost immediately, about something considerably larger than one abduction. Smith had been arrested at least 13 times in Florida since 1993, a criminal history spanning more than a decade across multiple counties. He'd previously been charged with kidnapping and false imprisonment in an entirely separate case, though he'd ultimately been acquitted of those charges, a detail that, in hindsight, reads less like exoneration and more like an early warning nobody had fully heeded. At the exact moment he abducted Carly, he was on probation for cocaine possession, a probation he was, at that very time, actively violating. And here is the detail that would end up generating genuine national outrage once the full picture became clear. A judge had previously declined to jail Smith for that probation violation, specifically because he'd failed to pay $411 in fines and court costs, with the judge noting on the record that Florida does not operate what's sometimes called a debtor's prison, a legal principle that, whatever its broader merits in protecting people from being jailed simply for poverty, meant a man with a 13-arrest history and an existing kidnapping charge on his record was walking free, entirely because of an unpaid fine smaller than most people's monthly grocery bill. I want to sit with that detail for a second, because I think it's the single most infuriating piece of this entire case. This wasn't a system that failed to notice Joseph Smith. It had noticed him repeatedly, 13 separate times over more than a decade, generating an entire paper trail of documented concern that any sufficiently attentive review should have flagged as an escalating pattern. It had already once before charged him with the exact category of crime that would eventually take Carly's life, an earlier warning that, however narrowly it ended in acquittal, should have kept him under considerably closer scrutiny than he actually received. And the specific mechanism that kept him free on the day he abducted her wasn't some sophisticated failure of detection at all. No missing forensic breakthrough, no overlooked piece of evidence. It was $411, and a legal principle about debt that, applied correctly in one narrow sense, protecting people from being jailed simply for being poor, ended up producing a catastrophic outcome in the broader one, releasing back onto the street exactly the kind of documented, repeat offender that principle was never actually designed to protect. Carly's body was found 4 days after her abduction, on the grounds of a church not far from where she'd been taken, discovered partially undressed. I'm not going to describe the physical evidence of what was done to her beyond what's already been publicly established by the court record, because Carly was 11 years old, and she deserves better than to have the worst details of her final hours turned into spectacle. What matters is that the state would later establish, in exhaustive courtroom detail, that Joseph Smith kidnapped Carly from that car wash parking lot, sexually assaulted her, and then strangled her to death. Prosecutors would later argue, specifically, to eliminate her as a witness who could identify him. Before we go further, I want to know who's sitting with this story tonight. If you're watching, drop your country and the time where you are down in the comments. I think about how a single piece of security camera footage from a car wash in Sarasota ended up circulating around the entire world, watched by people who have never set foot in Florida, who were perhaps not even born yet in 2004, becoming over time one of the most widely recognized pieces of surveillance footage in the entire history of the genre. And I like knowing exactly how far that footage and this story has traveled to reach you tonight. Just your country and your time. And then let's talk about what happened once Joseph Smith actually stood trial, because the case against him and the reaction to it reached considerably further than most cases of its kind. Smith was indicted on February 20th, 2004, less than 3 weeks after Carly's abduction, on charges of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and capital sexual battery. The nation's reaction to his arrest record, and to that debtor's prison ruling specifically, was significant enough that it directly spurred the introduction of both state and federal legislation aimed at tightening how probation violations are handled, an early, direct legislative response to exactly the kind of administrative gap that had kept Smith free. The trial itself, in late 2005, hinged heavily on that same car wash footage the entire country had already seen. Prosecutors played it for the jury in the actual courtroom, and observers described jurors watching with a visible, physical tension, some sitting forward in their seats, others pressing their fingers to their lips, watching the exact same 11 seconds of video that had already been broadcast around the world, now serving as the central piece of evidence in a capital murder trial, transformed from a piece of national media coverage into formal courtroom exhibit. The defense argued the footage alone was inconclusive, and that other possible suspects hadn't been properly investigated, pushing back specifically against what they characterized as an investigation that had moved too quickly once public identification made Smith the obvious target. The jury disagreed. After about 5 hours of deliberation, a relatively short stretch of time given the severity of the charges, they found Joseph Smith guilty of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and sexual battery. Smith reportedly nodded when the verdict was read, showing no other visible reaction, while Carly's relatives, seated nearby, embraced each other and wept. At sentencing, prosecutors argued for the death penalty directly, citing Carly's age, Smith's probation status at the time of the crime, and the specifically premeditated nature of the killing as aggravating factors. Smith, in his own statement to the court, tearfully claimed he'd taken large amounts of heroin and cocaine that day in what he described as an attempted suicide, and said he didn't remember much of what actually happened, asking the judge to spare his life for the sake of his own 3 daughters. The jury recommended death by a vote of 10-2. In December of 2005, Circuit Judge Andrew Owens formally sentenced Smith to death, telling the courtroom directly that the image of Smith taking Carly's arm and leading her away would no doubt be etched permanently into the collective memory of everyone who'd seen it. Carly's mother, Susan Shorpen, spoke to reporters outside the courthouse after the verdict, describing herself as broken, saying plainly that she would not rest until Smith was dead. Her grief in the years that followed took a genuinely devastating toll on her own life, the kind of prolonged, compounding damage that rarely makes it into the tidy narrative arc of a solved true crime case. She has spoken publicly about turning to drugs to numb the pain of losing her daughter, and was, by the time of Smith's actual sentencing hearing, incarcerated herself on drug and prostitution charges, unable to even be present in the courtroom for the sentence handed down in her own daughter's case. A mother absent from the single moment of legal reckoning that was supposed to bring her some measure of closure. It's a specific, quietly devastating kind of collateral damage that true crime stories don't always make room for. The way losing a child this violently can go on destroying a parent's life for years afterward, long after the cameras and the national headlines have moved on to the next story. The grief itself becoming its own kind of ongoing, unaddressed crime scene. Joseph Smith's death sentence, like many capital cases from that era, became entangled in years of appeals, particularly after a later Florida Supreme Court ruling required that death sentences be recommended unanimously by a jury, rather than by the 10-2 majority that had originally sentenced him. A legal shift that reopened dozens of older Florida death penalty cases across the state, including his. Smith was in the middle of a resentencing process, one that could conceivably have resulted in a life sentence rather than execution, given the new unanimity requirement, when he died in prison in July of 2021, at 55 years old, his exact cause of death not immediately disclosed by corrections officials. Carly's father, Joseph Brucia, told reporters he felt elated by the news, saying plainly that it was long overdue, and that where what he called an inept and corrupt criminal justice system couldn't finish the job, the natural order of things finally had. The state attorney overseeing the case offered a somewhat more measured reflection, saying that while nothing could bring Carly back, her family, her friends, and the entire Sarasota community would finally have closure, and would not have to endure any further court proceedings in pursuit of justice that, in the end, arrived through Smith's own death rather than through the sentence a jury had actually recommended for him 17 years earlier. There is something genuinely important about how this case actually unfolded that I think is worth naming directly. This wasn't a mystery that took years or decades to solve. It was solved within days, specifically because a piece of security footage was broadcast widely enough and clearly enough that ordinary members of a community recognized a face on their own televisions and picked up the phone, a genuinely rare speed for a case this serious. In an era before smartphones were universal, before social media could spread an image within minutes, a single car wash camera and a national news broadcast did exactly what they needed to do, functioning almost like an early improvised version of the exact kind of public alert systems that would become far more sophisticated and widespread in the years that followed. The genuine failure in this case sits somewhere else entirely. Not in the investigation after Carly disappeared, which moved about as quickly and effectively as any investigation reasonably could, but in everything that happened and didn't happen, in the 13 arrests and one narrowly technical legal ruling that came before it, that left a documented, repeat offender free to be standing in that parking lot at all, waiting for an 11-year-old girl to walk past on her way home from a Sunday visit with a friend. Carlie Brucia was 11 years old. She walked home from a friend's house on Super Bowl Sunday, eager to get back in time for the game, taking a route she'd probably walked plenty of times before without a second thought, on an evening her own family had, quite reasonably, thought nothing of letting her walk alone. A single security camera captured the last clear image the world would ever have of her alive, an image that ended up broadcast to millions of people who never knew her personally, replayed in courtrooms, in living rooms, and eventually in documentaries and news retrospectives for years afterward, alongside a debtor's prison ruling that, whatever its narrow legal logic, left a documented, repeat offender free to be standing in that same parking lot when she walked past it. Her mother's own life unraveled in the years that followed. One more casualty of a crime that never really stopped taking from this family. Even after a conviction, even after a death sentence, even after Smith's own death finally closed the case for good. Rest in peace, Carlie Brucia. See you in the next case.